here and the computer's over there. I have fashioned for myself a delightful fashion accessory because I needed a clip for this. So just so you know, this isn't any kind of statement. It's just a creative solution to a problem, which kind of works in terms of what I'm going to be talking about a little bit, which is, well, let's bring up the first slide, shall we? Here is Edward Blair coming downstairs now, bump, 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 on the back of his head behind Christopher Robin. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming downstairs, but sometimes he feels that there really is another way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment and think about it. This is the opening line from A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh, and is a kind of an embodiment for what my mind does all the time. A lot of the time I feel like I'm essentially getting dragged down the stairs, bumpity bump 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 behind somebody else dragging me along. And if I could just take a moment, just a little moment, and think about things, I might have a chance of finding a better way of doing whatever it is I'm doing. And I guess in a way it kind of relates to the things you've been talking about in terms of your education prior to coming here, and this whole thing of kind of being dragged by the nose in terms of here's this bunch of stuff that you have to do to pass so that we can get our figures up and so on. It all kind of comes into that. So it speaks to the thing that I'm sort of most interested in terms of my research, which is people's mindsets. Most of us can learn the technicalities of something, and we go through our music education learning the techniques of our instrument, and we learn the music theory and so on. But one of the most difficult things in terms of what we have to deal with as teachers, and this is about pedagogies, which is essentially the things that you try to impart as teachers, the things that translate into you putting knowledge over. Mindset is one of the most difficult things, but the mindset, what goes on up here in your internal narrative, is the thing that ultimately helps you grasp an idea, make it your own, and hopefully then make it creative. So as far as things go, it's one of the more difficult things to teach, which is why I'm fascinated by it. Ken Robinson, I should say, who rather famously did a TED talk on the nature of creativity in education, talked about the academic life. He said, the academic life tends to deny the rest of the body, and many school students are educated from the waist up, and attention comes to focus on their heads, and particularly the left side, which is what I put this picture up for. The left side supposedly is the side that deals with logic and science and maths and those kinds of things. It's a little bit of a weak sort of suggestion of what actually goes on in the brain, but in basic terms, as an analogy, it kind of works. This is where many professional academics live, in their heads and slightly to one side. They are disembodied in a certain way. They tend to look at their bodies as a form of transport for their heads. It's a way of getting their heads to meetings. So here we are in this academic world, and we spend a lot of time trying to define the skills that you're learning, trying to put it over here so that we break down all of these ideas and we say, right, this is the pathway to do something, and these are the exact little pieces of knowledge that you need to get there, and these are the exact ways that you can play your instrument. These are the exact techniques that you can put to your instrument in order to achieve these certain stylistics, these certain sounds, these certain ideas. And what is much harder to then do is think about how do you take that and turn it back into music. As academics, we deconstruct a lot. We analyze, we work things out. We think, how do all the parts come together, but we pull them apart to figure that out. And what we don't often do is think about how they come back together again. And how do all those little pieces, how do they make up something that is much larger than those little pieces, which is the whole? And that's what the mindset will kind of hopefully do, and what I've been focusing on. So in terms of the basis of creativity, a gentleman by the name of Fennell came up with this idea of a lexicon of creativity. In terms of how we learn, you start with replication, which is the kind of the techniques of what you do. You move on to formulation, which is combining the techniques of what you do with the theories of how those things work, and maybe you start thinking about genre-specific ideas or stylistics and so on. But you don't get into innovation unless your mindset starts to change, unless you're thinking about your rationales, your interpretations, your contexts, and your intents. So I started researching into creativity, and I spent a lot of time on it. Maybe more time than I would like to spend more time on it, is what I'm trying to say. Because it's such a huge topic, and like so many topics that we look at as academics, it's still only in a deconstructed place. There's not a lot of construction going on yet. And this is where I'm thinking about Edward Bear bumping down the sodding stairs again, is that I can see all of this deconstruction, and the thing that frustrates me all the time is that it's really, nobody's trying to put the pieces back together. Nobody's trying to give that over. So, for better or for worse, that's what I'm trying to do, and that's what my research is about. Specifically, at this point in time, that's predominantly around voice, because that's my main instrument and that's what I teach. So what I want to talk about a little bit today is Robert Weisberg's argument that creativity stems from knowledge and the transfer of knowledge and skill between domains. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how my knowledge in other areas has contributed to how I teach voice, and try and give you a little bit of a specific example. My initial ideas of thinking about analogies came from this mnemonic scamper, which essentially comes up with a what-if bunch of questions based on these ideas of substituting or combining. And particularly there was a what-if question in relation to adapt, which is what else is this like? Thinking about what else is this like? And that's where I started thinking about voice and progressing a little bit in terms of what I was doing with voice. So I started thinking about reframing little things. And the idea came very specifically from a problem that I was having a very long time ago when I was studying, when I wanted to establish greater fluidity in my phrasing. I was working on a bebop line called Little Willie Leaps, and it was a very wordy song, and I was really struggling with it because I was coming at it from a technical perspective. I was coming at it from the knowledge of how do I articulate my words, and I articulate my words in terms of syllables, and if anybody's done any kind of classical singing in their lifetime, then what you're taught as a young child is that you have to enunciate everything very clearly so that all your words can be heard, and you always have a little t at the end of your words that end in a t, and d is very clearly enunciated. And that was really messing up my mindset in terms of how I flowed. So I would be singing, oh, when I spoke to you today, my heart began to stray to you, my love, and so I swayed with you, my love, and as we danced, my heart began to do a number, and it's very articulate, but it really, I could only do it at such a speed because I was so focused on every syllable and every bit of enunciation. Now, I don't know why, when I was young, because I wasn't thinking much about skills, but at the age of 13, somebody taught me how to juggle. It's very nice of them. And somewhere along the line, as I was chilling and relaxing, because I juggle to relax sometimes, it occurred to me that my problem was that I wasn't, if I focus on one ball at a time, I'm going to start dropping it, which is what I was doing with my singing. I was focusing on one syllable at a time and enunciating. Whereas when I'm juggling, I'm already throwing the next ball up in the air, and that's what I'm thinking about. So I tried to apply that to what I was doing in terms of my singing. And as soon as I started thinking about the next syllable and flowing it through, it started to find flow again. And I got to, oh, when I spoke to you today, my heart began to sway to you, my love, and so I swayed with you, my love, and as we danced, my heart began to do a number, wonder why be so, I guess I really know, because I don't love you, I really know, I tell myself, and so on and so on. And I found speed, and I didn't lose the lyric. And it was that made the difference for me. It was just a change in my mindset, as opposed to any kind of technique or any sort of prescribed method of doing something. So that's what made me think about finding analogies for things rather than focusing all the time on the techniques. So here is one of the key things that has bothered me a lot about singing technique. We know a lot of stuff about the anatomy and physicality. A rather wonderful woman by the name of Jo Estelle did a whole lot of scientific research where she used endoscopies, which involves putting a camera down the throat and viewing what goes on in the larynx and the vocal folds. And she figured out a whole bunch of different things that people were doing technically when they were coming up with different kinds of sounds. She came up with this amazing technical model for a singing technique, which is brilliant, and we use it quite religiously here in teaching voice. And alongside that, she came up with this idea of an effort dial, that whatever you're doing, you can do it to a certain effort level. So if I'm, for example, I can tilt my larynx. I can tilt part of this larynx, and my vocal folds here, when I tilt them, become a little bit longer and thinner. And I can do that to varying effort levels. So if I do a little bit, oh, when I spoke to you today, my heart began to sway with you, my love. And if I do it a lot, oh, when I spoke to you today, my heart began to sway to you, my love. It becomes a much more sweet sound. And it's a very simple thing, but it's just the effort level of how far am I doing it? Am I doing it at about effort level 2, or am I doing it about effort level 5 or 8? It's all very sort of arbitrary in terms of thinking, and you start to turn yourself into some sort of mathematician and technical wizard kid, and it's works in terms of the technicalities of what you do. And it's a really great way to start, because you become aware of what you're doing, of the technicalities of yourself. You get some sense of all of that, but you lose something, because the natural impulses that might have originated those sounds in the first place are gone. Somewhere along the line, somebody was using those sounds before we analysed it and pulled it apart and thought about it and learnt it as this kind of stuff. So what did they do? Why did they get there? And that's, again, one of the questions that sits in the back of my head. So I started thinking about analogies first, just to help people learn it, because obviously if I say to somebody, just tilt that bit of your larynx and that will thin out your vocal folds, they go, right, sure, that's no problem at all. It's this weird concept. So one of the first things that I started thinking about was experiences that people have already had. What have you done in the past that might help you get that sense of what it is? So I started thinking about, what does it feel like? The act of tilting that bit and getting that thin folds, for example, is very familiar to me in terms of that's the same physical response I get when I'm savouring a piece of chocolate. You go, chocolate, that's that same sensation, I get that same little tilt and that same lengthening of the vocal folds. There's a lemon, which is a different thing in terms of narrowing another part of my anatomy and making it, if you get that, of like, oh, I didn't expect it to be that sour, and that makes a different sort of vocal thing change in what I'm doing. So that was step one. And that helped me a lot, almost instantaneously, in terms of getting certain quite difficult theoretical concepts into teaching. It's a little bit different for voice, because we can't just sit and press a key on a keyboard or a fret on a guitar. We have to imagine this stuff, and we have to get a sense of it physically. I feel that that is an advantage, because it makes me think more about what I do. It makes me more self-aware. Second thing I thought about was the fact that we're focusing all of our attention on here. We were spending a lot of time thinking, this is where the voice is, so this is where all of my energy and attention goes. And actually the act of singing, again, if I think about it backwards, somebody somewhere when they started singing will have done it, I assume, as an expression, as something needs to be gotten out, or I have something that I want to say, or I have some kind of creative impetus. And when you do have something to say, or when you have a response to something and you want to vocalize it, you don't just go, from there. You express it with your whole physical self. Your whole body gets involved, surely. If you get a surprise, it's not just it's a, yeah? So that's the next thing I started thinking about. I thought, well, it's embodied in what we do as technical singers. We talk about support and we talk about the musculature, but we've separated them out so much. That's what I mean by the idea of we put all of these pieces, we pull it all apart and we analyse it and we think about it in terms of these pieces, but we forget to put them back together. So we know I can do this to make that sound and I need to support it over here, but we don't see how it comes together. So now what we're doing is we're thinking fragmentedly. We're thinking, I must remember that I need to tilt that and I need to support that, and also I need to remember to move because there's got to be some stagecraft. Must also look at my audience because I'm supposed to make eye contact. Also, I have to communicate with the band because I remember they told me to do that. And everything becomes, which you'll know, surely, because you've all been there, you've all thought about, oh no, I have to do all of that. So, like I said, thinking about putting those parts back together. So, one of the first things I did in terms of thinking about the physicality of it was I decided that I needed experience in terms of physicality. It's easy enough to do research on stuff in terms of like, let's look at a whole bunch of stuff on books or Google it, and you come up with a whole bunch of information. You can say, this is it, I have it. The academic response again. what I did instead was book myself in with a personal trainer and start a box. So in learning to box, why not? I can also threaten all of you. So in learning how to box, I got a stronger sense of how all of this was moving and working. I got a stronger sense of my core musculature, my intercostal musculature. I was more aware of how my physical stance was behaving. So without even thinking about it, I was already planting better seeds for my stagecraft, as well as getting a stronger understanding of my physicality, and also getting the relationship back together in terms of my physical self here and this here. Because when you do one thing and you're paying attention, which is kind of the key to all of this, you have to pay attention to what you're doing, because if you're not paying attention, you won't be able to put the pieces back together. I was noticing that if I was putting in an effort, I would make certain sounds. If I, for example, I have a natural response when I feel like I'm being a bit of an idiot, or when I don't get something, when I'm going, that was just terrible, that I will naturally go, there's that tilt thing again that I was talking about. And now it's engaged with the muscles. So it's just this constant self-awareness. And this is more about the mindset, again, of being self-aware enough to recognise what you're doing and get to there. So I learned about this, and I started piecing those things together by being more aware. One day I was walking down the stairs in the corridors when we were still up at Craig House, the beautiful campus, and somebody I hadn't seen in 2 years came up the stairs, and instead of going, I'm so happy to see you, I went, that's that thing, the technical thing. So, that self-awareness, it does have its downsides in terms of you become self-obsessed. But there it is. So, the next thing that I was thinking about, this is where I love research the most. I really like a good box set binge. So, one of the things that I was box set binging a few years ago is a program called Lie to Me. And Lie to Me has this basis in the work of Paul Ekman, who talks about micro-expressions and kind of reading people's tiny little micro-expressions in terms of what they do. And I found that really interesting. So I looked at Paul Ekman myself and got some stronger sense of just the physical triggers in terms of what we do naturally when we respond to certain situations. And that kind of put the last piece in place for me in terms of let's get all of the elements stuck back together and reconstructed. And so what I ended up with was this idea of all of our different emotions coming in at slightly different levels in terms of I can be sort of quite content. And when I'm quite content, I feel pretty relaxed here. But now, because I've been doing the core training, I also feel strong, as opposed to the content week, then binging on cake and box sets. So feeling quite content, and that gives me this nice sort of easy place to be, and it feels a little bit like the savouring of chocolate. So content is quite a nice place to be for a nice easy vocal. Whereas if I go all the way up and think about being full on ecstatic happy, when I'm really happy about something, I think back to that excitement of seeing somebody that I hadn't seen for ages. I'm like, yes, and instantly my physicality changes. And that physicality changes, all kinds of other things respond here. Now, I know what they are, but I'm not going to bore you with all of that information. But I do know that I've pieced these things together. So now instead of just, it's like, I'm feeling good about something, and my physical self responds, and that creates something in terms of what I'm doing with my voice. And in putting those pieces back together, what I did was then reimagine this effort dial of 1 to 10 as what if we're thinking about that effort dial as different levels of how I feel an emotion. And for me, at any rate, in terms of, I teach at this stage in year 3, when we think about it on this level of let's think about the mindset. We've done a whole bunch of stuff about the technicalities. We know how all those pieces come together. But when we get to here, when we're thinking about the mindset, then we start reimagining what we're doing in terms of its creative principles again. We start to think about our intentions, and it becomes more than just a technical virtuosity, which is one of the things that frustrated me a lot when I was studying as well, is that you'd have so much technical virtuosity, but some of those people that I was listening to that were getting the high marks because they were amazing technicians, I couldn't be bothered listening to it. And I guess it makes a little bit of that same thing about what we were hearing earlier in terms of rather be a rock drummer because that's something that speaks to you. And it's when you hear somebody that genuinely enjoys what they're doing, that physicality is there, that sense of enjoying something, it's in what you do. So in terms of how I interpret that and what I've put into that, I feel like if I put a little bit of my other sort of skills transfers and other bits of knowledge in there, I have a background in drama, I have a bit of boxing now, I have a background in kind of weird things as well. Like for a while I was very strangely an IT specialist. Very strangely. All of these little things that I've done, I learnt to stilt walk once. That was kind of useful in a way. If I think about all the things that I know, I can bring them into this place at the end of the day and make it into something. So it becomes, even in the stagecraft of it, and ultimately where I took it in year 4, I'll skip ahead a little bit, is thinking about stagecraft and how that might come down. So that instead of thinking about a whole bunch of the techniques that I need, I'm thinking about being one of 4 potential things. I'm thinking about being a communicator maybe, in which case my whole thought is just about being a narrator of a story. And when I'm a communicator, I'm thinking about being quite conversational in what I do, and I'm thinking about making eye contact with people, so my stagecraft is in place, and the way that I perform a song, also without even thinking about it, just by thinking all I'm trying to do is communicate an idea. If I splurt out a tiny bit of a song, sorry. The night is like a lovely tune. Beware my foolish heart. All I'm doing is just trying to narrate some information to you. If I think about it in terms of an actor, I try and put myself right there in that moment. So now I'm trying to think about what the experiences are if I'm in that moment, and who I might be if I was talking to somebody rather than just relaying the information to my audience. So now I'm trying to envision something else. The night is like a lovely tune. Beware my foolish heart. The dynamic becomes a little bit different. The stagecraft becomes a little bit different. Even my vocal qualities become a little bit different. If I'm thinking about it in terms of a dancer, what I'm thinking about is responding very specifically to music, and I'm thinking about entertainment and having a good time with it. Yeah? So then it becomes, the night is like a lovely tune. Beware my foolish heart. And now I'm moving with the music of it. And if I'm thinking in terms of an entertainer, I'm thinking about all of those things together, and I'm just there to put on a show. Well, the night is like a lovely tune. Beware my foolish heart. And it becomes much bigger. And that's what I've kind of like, in terms of a very vroom overview from years 1 to 4, and thinking about building from the technicalities to trying to get somewhere into that mindset, so that at the end, after going through all of the pieces, all of those tiny little chunks that you've dealt with, bringing it all back into just a single mindset that is your intention, so that you then become a creative practitioner with a very definite intent and purpose to what you do. The end. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions for Renée?
Why do you separate communicator and actor? Aren't they sort of the same thing? When you're acting, you want to communicate what the person is.
To be perfectly honest, the labels are a little bit arbitrary. So communicator I think of specifically as in terms of what I'm doing right now. I'm communicating information, but I'm doing it from a perspective of being once removed from the information. So I'm not experiencing it right now like the actor is. The actor I think of as you're putting it over as if you were living that moment right then and there, whereas communicator, I'm relaying the information after the event and letting somebody know about it.
Renée, have you had to modify the way you teach singing, having done this study?
No, because I've always been weird. What I have done is modify the stuff that I'm working with, but it's always a work in development. And actually, the very first image that you saw up there, which is the fern before it unfurls, which is the koru in Māori. I come from New Zealand, and the Māori culture talks about the koru and that fern, and it's a representative of the idea of perpetual movement and consistently coming back to the point of origin. And that's kind of how I'm working all the time. Everything that I'm doing, it keeps moving on. So even what I'm doing today, it'll move on next year. It always does. This year I started Cuban salsa dancing, so that's going to start coming into play very soon. Because, you can only box for so long. So this idea of the perpetual movement and coming back to the point of origin. So you just keep going around, and I'm back to where I started. But every time I come back to where I started, I'm a little bit more informed, and I'm more enthusiastic about that starting point, because I've got new ways to look at it. And every time I've got new ways to look at it, my head is much more excited and more engaged. And also, it will spring out into other areas. So I don't think it's changed anything about the way that I approach teaching, but what it has done is it consistently, year upon year, improves the experience for me in terms of what I do creatively, and I think improves the experience for the students that I work with. If I could, everybody that I worked with when I first started teaching, I'd bring them all back. Say, guys, look, I've come up with all this other stuff, please come back, because I want to do this again, okay? Carlos?
See, like the extra things you're doing, like boxing and such, how much do you think that influences in your progression and becoming a better singer? And do you think it is the same for everyone?
So I think it's a little bit different for everybody, because first of all, the first question, it's made a huge difference for me because one, the fact that I'm physically fitter. What I've discovered, you get so many little discoveries along the way when you're exploring one thing that it impacts in so many other ways. And being physically fitter and stronger, I've noticed I hardly have to warm up at all before singing now. I can do a quick and because the muscle is all there, I'm pretty much good to go. Whereas in the past, it would have taken me much longer to warm up. The other thing that I've noticed is that because I'm more active, like I've always been fairly active, but the more active I am, I'm also happier. Because what I've noticed is a direct correlation between the amount of time I spend sat at my computer and how depressed I am. If I'm up and moving more, there's something that happens in terms of, I'm happier now. And the other thing that I've noticed is because even in boxing, or any kind of physical exercise, because my mind is thinking about, right, how can I do this exercise so that I achieve what I want to achieve? Like there's things like doing crunchies on a Swiss ball and having to really focus your attention inward so that you remain on that Swiss ball and don't topple off to the side. Even that, mentally, I found that it's trained me in terms of keeping my focus on something and really being able to hone in on a singular thing in that way and focus on that. So it's had an impact even on my ability to focus academically, which I wasn't expecting, so it all kind of has an impact. I think it's a little bit different for everybody. I specifically chose boxing because I need a little bit of a vent now and then to get out some of my aggression. Other people respond better to yoga because it's more sort of peaceful and calming. The woman who's teaching vocals alongside me at the moment, Georgia, she does yoga and she's so calm. And she's noticed how that's really had such a massive impact on her singing and her sort of ability to breathe and so on. So it'll be a little different for everybody, but the physicality of it. And then I've also noticed, like, I started salsa dancing in September, and that again has had an impact on stronger understanding of rhythm, and has had an impact, interestingly, on my ability to read another person better when I'm boxing, so I'm more ready for defending myself. And then also has more impact on my stagecraft and musicality. So it all just keeps, like I said, it's that perpetual motion, and it keeps coming back to the point of origin. But it's cool because I've got more colours and more textures all the time. Duncan?
Hi. Earlier you were saying about when you were juggling that if you concentrate too much on the individual balls, you end up dropping them. And then you were just saying about the boxing was allowing you to focus on one thing at a time. How is it at the end when you were the entertainer that you were able to combine all those elements at once without dropping the balls, essentially?
It comes down to, like I said, focusing on that one big thing. if I know that my purpose is essentially to entertain, so by putting my mindset in a place of I want to reach as far as I can and be as big as I can, and that was as far as it went. But because that's all there, my physicality responded by becoming bigger, and everything else responded by becoming bigger. But it comes first from a place of muscle memory. Like, I had to have the muscle memory of the technique first, which is what I was saying. I don't start introducing the idea of mindset until third year, because without having that technical ability beforehand, then I can't bring all of those pieces together. So it's not until the muscle memory is there that will come.
Maybe one more question, I think.
I was just wondering, in terms of what Gareth was saying about kind of getting lost or found in music, how do you find that you have reached a point where you can achieve things technically and get lost in it? Because I always find that my better performances are actually when I'm not lost in it and when I'm thinking about what I should actually be doing or communicating.
Yeah. So, to clarify, do you mean communicating? What do you mean by lost in it?
Like when I'm completely immersed in the song and the emotion and how I'm relating to it, as opposed to from a kind of technical view of, oh, I need to use this quality or this on set, and this is what I'm trying to communicate to whoever's listening.
Okay, so here's one of those things again where I think that there's an element of like how far you become technically before you can start honing in on that. I think part of it also is that there's an element of thinking about communication in general. When you're up here as a performer, you need to be aware that part of it is about what you want to express, but part of it is also about expressing it clearly. It's similar to even me up here on stage now. If I was just talking everything that was in my head, you would have had a very different experience. And it wouldn't have had any kind of clarity whatsoever. So I need to be aware of those two things together. And in terms of that, it's understanding what I want to say enough that I also understand that I'm putting it to somebody else. And it's the same for me as a performer, that I have to be, I think there's a sort of a sense of hypervigilance in it almost. As a performer, I think the biggest thing that's been helpful to me is improvisation, because you learn to be hyper aware of everything. You learn to be hyper aware of what's going on in terms of the band and making sure you pick up on all the little musical cues that go on, and you learn to be hyper aware of the audience and what you're experiencing there. And if you've had the time to sort of develop that skill, and it takes time to develop, alongside the muscle memory of all your technical abilities, then you start to read the room and you respond to that room. So even within, and I find again in terms of skills transfer, that translates into the classroom. If I'm looking at the classroom, there's always the moment when you realise, oh, these people need a break now, and recognising when that break is needed, or recognising that now is the time when I need to give them something to do because their attention is drifting, and it's not because they're tired, it's just because they've been staring at that board for 10 minutes now, and 10 minutes is enough before you start to drift. And it's all those kinds of things in terms of just getting a sense of the room. But it takes time to sort of recognise that. And I think that there's an initial sense of, like, most of us will come at music either from the perspective of I want to learn these skills because I want to earn a living in this area, and you come at it from the understanding of like an extrovert's understanding of, I really enjoy interacting with people. So those people are kind of going to be fine in that context of performing. Is that a cue? Like the music at the end of the Oscar speech. And then there's other people that are going to come at it initially because musically they have something to express. It's a means to express something that they're not able to express in any other way, shape or form. And when you're from that perspective, which is slightly more introverted form, then it takes a little bit of time to sort of get it out to the audience and recognise that you need that interaction with the audience. So it's a slightly different thing. But when the muscle memory is there, you train your mindset to think about those things as a one.
Okay, thank you very much.